The docking clamps hit, and Camel already knew something was wrong, not with the ship, but with whatever was on the other side of the airlock. He'd felt wrong dockings before. The perihelion had kissed berths on 43 stations across the belt and outer planets, and each one had its own signature: the authoritative clunk of Ceres Station, the apologetic shudder of Ganymede, the arthritic groan of Tycho's aging gantry arms. This was none of those. The clamps engaged with a sound like something biological sealing shut, wet and deliberate, and the hull sensors threw readings that made no sense. Variable heat distribution, pressure fluctuations in a Fibonacci pattern, and a magnetic signature that changed every 11 seconds like a heartbeat. "Camel," Captain Draper's voice through the comm, tight and precise. "Suit up, EVA." "Whose ship is it?" He was already pulling his suit from the locker, muscle memory. "Vreth." He stopped. "The docking request came in accord standard," Draper said before he could ask. "Automated. Whatever sent it wasn't talking." Camel sealed his helmet and tried to remember everything he knew about the Vreth. Not much. No human had spent more than 20 minutes aboard a Vreth vessel and come back with useful intelligence. The ships didn't permit extended access, the way a body doesn't permit extended presence of a foreign object. He knew they were insected. He knew their technology was grown, not manufactured. He knew they had fought humanity to a standstill at Kepler's reach 14 years ago, and then simply stopped, as if the war had become uninteresting. He knew their ships were alive. He cycled through the lock, and the void took him. The Vreth warship was enormous. The perihelion was a sturdy working vessel, 240 meters of recycled steel and jury-rigged sensor arrays, and the warship made her look like a dinghy lashed to a tanker. It stretched 3 kilometers along his line of sight, and it was not the shape of something manufactured. It curved and ridged and plated in patterns that suggested growth rather than construction, chitinous panels the color of burnt amber overlapping like scales, or feathers, or the armor of something very old that had learned to be very large. And it was bleeding. Not blood, light. A deep violet luminescence pulsed and dimmed along a sheer cut in the armor plating that ran 40 meters down the ship's port flank, ragged at the edges in a way that metal didn't tear, more like the edge of a wound. The light strobed in irregular patterns: long pulse, 3 short, long; long, 3 short, long. A signal pattern or a distress response or something he didn't have a framework for. He fired his EVA pack and crossed to it. Up close, the shear was worse than it looked. The outer plating had been cut laser or railgun, something military, and the inner structure exposed was not circuitry or conduit. It was latticed crystal, translucent purple-gray, and it moved. Slow contractions and expansions, a respiration he could see with his helmet light but not explain. Fiber-like structures had begun to pull themselves toward the wound's edges in what looked distressingly like an attempt to close. They weren't making it. Camel pulled his diagnostic scanner and pressed it against the crystal lattice. The readings came back wrong, then wrong in a different way. Then the scanner tried a third interpretive framework and gave him something he could almost work with. The crystal lattice was a conductor, signal medium. The contractions were data transmission, not biological function, or they were both, which was worse. He looked at the shear again, 40 meters long. The breach had severed the lattice in 600 places minimum. Behind him, something moved. He turned slowly. The nearest hull panel had opened, not a hatch, nothing mechanical, just a section of the amber plating folding back on itself like a flower opening wrong. And through it he could see the interior of the ship, and in the interior, ranked in absolute stillness, were soldiers. The Vreth soldiers were 2.5 meters tall, the same burnt amber as the hull, and they were not moving. Not even the slight shift of weight, the micro-adjustments of a body at rest. Perfectly still, the way a machine is still when it is waiting for a command that has not arrived. 100 of them from what he could see, probably more. Camel turned back to the lattice wound and kept scanning. The soldiers didn't shoot. He took that as an invitation. The deeper readings were coming clear now, and they were not good. The lattice wasn't just a communications medium. It was a central routing system, and the routing system connected to a single node deep in the ship. The node was fragmenting. Long pulse, 3 short, long. The distress signal, yes, but also something else. A system running out of coherent state. He knew what that meant in machines. A feedback cascade, progressive, terminal if the interruption wasn't addressed. He thought about what it might mean in something that was both machine and alive. Draper, he keyed his comm. The warship's navigation and control system is damaged. Signal degradation, progressive. I think it's got maybe 6 hours before it goes fully incoherent. Can you fix it? He looked at the 600 severed crystal lattice connections, and his toolkit, and the 1,000 years of alien engineering philosophy that had produced a thing he'd never seen before in his life. I'm going to need more solder. The Vreth didn't have a word for repair. Camel was starting to think they didn't have a concept for it either. He'd been working for 40 minutes inside the breach, and in that time the soldiers had cycled through threat posture, weapons raised, that particular stillness that meant loaded and aimed 6 times. Each time they held it for 3 minutes and then stood down, not because anything had changed, but because the command to fire apparently hadn't arrived. Whatever signal processing node was supposed to authorize lethal action was the same node currently coming apart in pieces. He was relying on a fragmented alien nervous system to keep him alive. He was choosing to think of this as job security. Camel, Draper again, harder now. I need you back on the perihelion. I'm in the middle of something. You're in the middle of a Vreth warship surrounded by hostile soldiers, and you've been EVA for 53 minutes, and I need 20 minutes, he said, maybe 30. The comm went quiet in the way that meant Draper was deciding how much she was willing to fight him on this. He'd learned the specific texture of that silence over 3 years on her crew. It usually resolved in his favor, but it cost something every time. The problem was the lattice material itself. Vreth biomechanical crystal used a conductive mechanism he'd never seen, not electron flow, not photonic transmission. Something in between that required a medium he didn't carry. His diagnostic scanner had given him a partial materials analysis. The crystal lattice operated by modulating the alignment of something the scanner translated as oriented polar domains, which meant exactly nothing to him in practical terms, except that copper wire shouldn't work. He was going to try copper wire anyway. The key was the bridge. If he could create a continuous conductive path across the severed sections, not the right medium, not the right impedance, not the right anything, but a path, a route, something the signal could limp along instead of dying at each break, the node might stabilize. Might. The math on might here was bad, and he knew it. He stripped wire from his repair kit and started building junctions. The soldiers cycled to threat posture again. He didn't look up. A new signal cut through his comm, not Draper, something else. The translator drone that had been hovering at the breach edge since he started work, broadcasting in accord standard. Replacement, replacement, replacement. He'd been ignoring it. Now it shifted. Organic component camel, cease. Replacement, cease. Tell it I'm busy, he said to no one. He soldered the first copper bridge across a lattice break. The crystal shivered. Not a mechanical vibration, something that moved through the lattice itself. A traveling pulse that reached the bridge junction, encountered the copper and stuttered. Stopped. Then, slowly, pushed through. Hug, Camel said. The signal was moving. Wrong, distorted, the polar domain equivalent of a transmission through a tin can and a string, but moving. The Queen screamed. Not sound. The violet luminescence along the entire wound edge spiked to white, and the pulse pattern went chaotic, long, long, short, short, long, long, nothing, a burst of rapid flickers, and then resolved into something different. Not the distress pattern. something he didn't have a catalog entry for. The translator drone stopped saying, "Replacement." The soldiers snapped to threat posture and held it. From deep in the ship something moved, big. The hull vibrated with the rhythm of it, slow and deliberate, and through the open panel Camel could see the soldiers part. A figure came through them, taller than the soldiers, plated differently. The amber panels on this one were finer, layered like hammered scale, and they caught the violet light and scattered it in patterns that had nothing to do with camouflage. Command markings, maybe, or rank. The figure stopped 2 meters from the breach. Organic component Camel. The voice came from the translator drone, but the input was coming from the figure in front of him. "You are altering the sovereign matrix. This is not permitted." Camel looked up from his work for the first time in 20 minutes. "The sovereign matrix is dying. I'm trying to stop that." "The sovereign matrix is damaged. Replacement protocol has been initiated." "Replacement is 11 days out." He went back to the wire. "She'll be gone in 6 hours." "Replacement." 11 days, he said again. He soldered the second junction. "I've got 30 minutes left on this. You can shoot me after." Silence. The commander, Kethra, the translator, tagged it, designation military executor, was still. The soldiers were still. Camel was the only thing moving in the entire 3-kilometer ship. He built the third junction. The fourth. His hands were steady in the way they got when there was nothing left to do but work, when the decision had already been made and the only question was execution. Draper was going to debrief him very thoroughly about this. He'd looked at the damage. He'd seen a problem. The problem had a solution, probably, if he built it fast and built it right. That was the job. The fifth junction completed the first run of the bridge. The signal moved, limping, distorted, barely coherent, across 20 meters of severed lattice. The Queen's pulse pattern changed. Not the distress signal, not the chaos pattern, something slower, more structured, like a sentence rather than a scream. The translator drone took 4 seconds to process it and then said, "What is this human doing?" Not a question. Camel noticed the syntax. Kethra had asked questions. The translator had rendered them with rising inflection. This statement was flat, observational, as if the Queen was narrating to herself and the translator had accidentally caught it. He kept working. "Camel," Draper again, and this time her voice had a different texture. She'd looked at something, probably the hull sensors. "What are those readings?" "Lattice signal," he said. "It's moving." "Through what?" "Copper." He soldered the fifth junction. The silence from Draper had a new quality. He'd describe it later to her face as impressed. She'd probably describe it as horrified. Both were probably accurate. The soldiers hadn't shot him. The commander hadn't moved. He had maybe 20 minutes before that changed, and he was going to use every one of them. The Queen spoke in fragments, like a sentence with every third word missing, and Camel answered every fragment like it was complete. He'd learned to do that with damaged systems. When a ship's computer lost coherence, cascading memory failure, sector corruption, the particular kind of breakdown that happened when hardware met physics it hadn't been designed for, it would produce output that was half right. Partial sentences, incomplete telemetry, a system reaching for what it used to know and catching every third word. You didn't wait for the full message. You built the bridge from what you had and kept the power on. The first coherent fragment had come through the translator drone while he was finishing the secondary run, a single breath symbol that the translator rendered as purpose. Not a question, just the concept, floating alone, aimed at him. "Fixing the conductor break," he'd said, to the amber plating in front of his face, because that was where the sound pickup was closest. "The signal needs a path. I'm building one out of wrong materials, and it'll hold if I do the junctions right. And I need to do the junctions right, so stop counting down to when you're going to shoot me, because I can feel you doing it, and it's affecting my solder work." Another fragment, wrong. "Yes," he agreed, Copper's wrong, geometry's wrong, impedance is completely wrong. He stripped the next wire. It'll work anyway. The fragment after that took 40 seconds to arrive, and the translator flagged it as uncertain. Impossible. Sure, Camel said. He was inside the armor junction now, inside the Queen's external nervous system. Physically, his torso wedged between two layers of crystal lattice with his helmet pressed against the inner surface. It was warm. Not equipment warm, not the frictional warmth of running systems, body warm, the temperature of something alive. He tried not to think about what that meant for what he was currently doing to it with a soldering iron. The question of what Sekthara was experiencing had occurred to him, and he had put it aside because he couldn't do anything about it and he needed to finish the work. But the lattice around him was responsive in a way that passive conductors weren't. When he made a junction, the crystal near the connection point would orient. The polar domains the scanner had identified shifting toward the new pathway, testing it. Learning it, maybe. The system was not just accepting the repair. It was integrating it. He was most of the way through the third run when the junction failed. One wire. Bad solder connection, his fault. He'd rushed the heat application at the 40-minute mark when his hands started to ache, and the junction had looked solid but wasn't. The signal in that run died. 20 meters of lattice went dark, and the pulse pattern spiked chaos again, and outside in the ship something moved very fast. The Queen fragmented. Through the armor plating he could feel it. The lattice contractions went irregular, arrhythmic, the oriented domains losing their orientation in a wave pattern that moved from the dead junction outward. The violet light at the wound edges went white and then dark and then flickered in a pattern he recognized from the beginning. Long pulse, 3 short, long. The distress signal. She was back at the start. Kethra moved into his peripheral vision. The commander raised one of the upper limbs, 4 of them. The Vreth had 4 upper limbs, and the gesture was unmistakable across every species barrier Camel had ever encountered. An execution order. The soldier's weapons charged. He heard it, a sound like a breath being held across 100 throats at once. He found the bad junction. His hands were shaking, and he noticed this the way he noticed his hands, which was to say he noticed what they were doing and let them continue doing it. He pulled the failed solder connection with his pick tool, stripped the wire end, applied heat. Controlled. Even. The way his father had taught him in the machine shop on Tycho Station when Camel was 11 years old and impatient and had rushed a weld, and his father had put a hand over his and said, "The metal knows when you're afraid of it." He wasn't afraid of the metal. He was afraid of everything else, but the metal he trusted. The new junction formed. He pressed his thumb against it, an old habit from the work that had cost him his last crew, the seal he'd certified and signed with his print before it failed, and held it while the solder cooled. The lattice around him shivered. Signal moved. Not limping this time. The copper bridge had been integrating for 40 minutes, the crystal lattice learning the wrong material, reorienting around its constraints, and now the signal traveled the third run in a sweep that lit the interior of the armor junction from inside violet, then white, then a deep and steady purple that pulsed once, twice, and found a rhythm. One rhythm, the same rhythm across the whole repair. The soldiers stood down. Not one, not a squad, not in sequence. All of them, simultaneously. A single motion in 40,000 bodies, weapons lowering in the same instant, like a single breath released. The sound of it, 400,000 weapon safeties engaging at once, was the most beautiful thing Camel had heard since his last crew chief told him the engines were good. He lay still inside the armor junction and breathed. The translator drone had gone quiet during the crisis. It came back now, slowly, resolving into clear signal as the Queen's coherence returned. Camel pulled himself out of the junction, retrieved his tools by feel, and emerged into the exterior of the breach. Kethra was still there. The commander's weapon was not raised, but the upper limb hadn't fully lowered either, a frozen midpoint, and interrupted order. The Queen's pulse was steady. Not distress, not chaos. Coherent, controlled, the long, slow pulse of a system running its diagnostics, checking its own state. Camel could feel it in the lattice around him, through his suit's hull sensors, a systematic query moving from the repair site outward, evaluating each copper junction, each bridged break, each raw material solution he had built into her nervous system. He wiped grease off his chin with the back of his glove and waited. 30 seconds, a minute. The diagnostic pulse made 3 complete circuits of the repair, and each time it returned to the central node, the pulse steadied, stabilized, like a system checking a calculation twice, then a third time, then accepting the result even though the result shouldn't be possible. Then silence across the ship. Complete silence. The hum of the warship systems, the breathing of the lattice, the micro-vibrations of 40,000 soldiers standing at rest, all of it held, suspended. Sekthara spoke. Not through the translator drone. Through the lattice itself, through Camel's suit sensors, through the hull of the perihelion, through the copper wire he had built into her external nervous system. Directly. Her voice rendered by the translator as something between a transmission and a statement, formal and completely coherent for the first time since the perihelion had docked. Who fixed my armor? Not a question. The flat syntax of the earlier fragment, something narrating to itself, something that had processed an impossible result and was holding it up to the light to examine it. The translator drone hovered 2 meters from Camel's helmet. Kethra's 4 limbs were still. 40,000 soldiers waited. Camel looked at his toolkit, at the grease on his gloves, at the copper wire running in improbable loops along 40 meters of alien armor plating. "That be me," he said.